Hello and welcome to the CIPD's HR People Pod. My name's David D'Souza. I'm Director of Profession at the CIPD, and we're taking a break from our normal rhythm of looking at different things on a fortnightly basis that are impacting the world of work to do one of our deep dives into a particular area. Today, I'm absolutely delighted that we've got a guest joining us to talk about what happens in the room where it happens, and more specifically, what happens at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I wasn't there this year, managed to have a calendar clash for that, but we do have someone who was. So, Allyn Bailey, I'm absolutely delighted that you're joining us today. It'd be wonderful if you could tell us just a little bit about yourself before we get into the event and your thinking from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for the conversation. So my name is Allyn. I am currently part of an organization called SmartRecruiters. I'm a part of the SAP family of companies. We're focused on the work technology that supports hiring, how people both look at, apply for, and connect people to work and jobs. And so that's the primary focus area. I focus most of my attention looking at what's going on in this space, where evolution needs to go. And I've been doing a lot of deep dives into the conversation around the evolution of AI and identity and what that looks like for all of us as we start to go into this brave new world.
Fantastic. And Elaine, I think you've got a book coming out as well, haven't you, on identity? Is that correct?
I do. I am in the throes of crafting a lot of this narrative that I've been working on around identity and work. So identity gravity is heading this direction. We are hopefully not too far away. 6, 7 months, give or take.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to seeing that one kind of hit the light of day. So you obviously had the exceptional opportunity to go to Davos this year. Is that a regular thing for you? Have you been doing this for many years, or is this the first timer?
No, this was the first year. I got the opportunity to kind of ride shotgun with our CEO, Rebecca Carr, and to be there to kind of help support her, which gave me entree into conversations and spaces that I probably normally would not have been in. And it was hugely interesting to do. But yeah, first time there, first time kind of experiencing what is a very surreal event, honestly.
What were you expecting? So, very first time for you, what were you expect? Were you expecting to turn up and secret societies and people in cloaks, or were you expecting what you ended up getting?
I think there was a little bit of that expectation. I guess I expected that there would be a lot of interesting conversations going on. I expected maybe that it would be transparently, maybe a little bit more structured and pre-planned in terms of how those dialogues started to happen. More framework around kind of this meeting would happen here, or this meeting would happen there. I think what I found when I got on the ground is that it's a much more organic experience. That there is kind of these structures around what you can access and where you can be, and kind of managing all of the logistics of that. But past that, the dialoguing and conversations are much more open-ended and kind of happen in much more organic frameworks. Somebody starts a conversation, the next thing you know, you're sitting in a room with a bunch of people who have similar ideas and thoughts, and it's expanding from there. From me, as somebody whose job and responsibility is to help structure and plan kind of where our CEO shows up and what conversations are happening, it was a definitely new experience having to kind of navigate that space.
Fantastic. So, what was the average person there like? Albeit each person there may not be average. I think that's probably a fair way of describing it.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, the average person there was probably more average than you would imagine. Most of the people there were like ourselves. I would say were staffers, or not maybe necessarily what we kind of think of as the official delegates. The stuff that happens in that convention hall and that convention space is very hard to get into. Most people don't have access to it. You're not necessarily kind of sitting, when we say in the room where it happened, you're probably watching a live stream in another space and having a conversation with others around it. Not very likely kind of sitting in the room listening to Macron talk directly, right? Those are not where most of the people are. Most of the people were individuals who are adjacent or tangential to some of the thinkers in this space and helping kind of drive the next level of conversation. So it's a lot of people walking through the snowy streets, bumping into each other who spend a lot of time managing other people's schedules and calendars and writing other people's talking points. That's what I saw.
Fantastic. We look, we've got a range of questions coming up, but I'm genuinely curious.
Great.
What was the highlight? What was the highlight for you? What did you go? I'm really glad that I came. Now I've heard that or met that one person.
I think the highlight for me was actually listening into the combination of tech leaders, Satya, others in that realm, who were talking in this very kind of business oriented lens around how they are seeing the evolution of AI, in combination with individuals who were looking at the economics and political frameworks of their countries and trying to think about how this was all combining. So being able to both listen or be in the space where they were having those sorts of conversations together, I think was really fascinating for me. And it allowed me to have a different level of thinking around kind of what a lot of us are doing in this work tech space and how it's actually influencing and impacting the world's kind of cultural and political environments.
Fantastic, because there's a zoom out, zoom in piece here, isn't there? Which is it's very much about
Yeah.
how individuals experience work, but that's having impact at a societal, economic level. What was the prevailing sentiment amongst the people that you spoke to about the current state of work in the economy?
So I think what's really interesting is that there is this cross section of situations that are happening, right? With the incremental increase of AI that is coming into the workforce and that we're starting to see get applied. There is this open question about what the actual downstream implications will be to kind of societies and how we kind of adjust and adapt to it. What was interesting was, I think, the uncovering that there is a distinction between what kind of most of us are experiencing right now, which is kind of AI being applied as kind of add-ons or being used to support current workflows and processes that we're already doing. So it's all about automation, making us faster, being able to accomplish more in our day. That's really where that productivity conversation is. But when it really started to go down to the next level, what I started to hear was a deeper conversation happening about actually, does this create for us a complete re-engineering of what it means to work? And how do societies and populations start to adjust to perhaps kind of new whole frameworks for what work is? And are we prepared for that? So I think that kind of larger global conversation was interesting. And I think time for us to start having it, right? That is moving past using technology to augment our current practices to actually starting to think about how it starts to re-engineer what our organizations, our work processes, what that all looks like, and what is the downstream implication of that.
There's something really interesting happening in that, isn't there? Because there's a couple of questions, I guess. One is the time frame for it. So the future is always very open, but actually we're talking 5 years, 10 years for that kind of shift. And then the second one, I think, is probably around who gets to design those frameworks and whether that happens organically or whether it happens in a planned and controlled way. If we start with the timescale question, was there kind of prevailing sentiment? And I'm sure there was some divergence in opinion because you read different narratives, don't you, in the press, and depending on who
Mhm.
you speak to. There are some going, this is overblown in the short term, but something's definitely going to happen long term. And there's another school of thought, which is that the next 18 months is going to be massively different. Where did you end up, or what did you end up thinking from your conversations?
I actually think it's much more of a spectrum than that. I think that we have to think about these shifts happening in a couple of different levels simultaneously. So I think depending upon where you are, what type of work you do, whether we are talking about sub-Saharan Africa or whether we are talking about, the middle of Europe and in kind of France and Germany and in those spaces, you're going to see some differences in how this starts to adjust and apply, right? And I think that's going to change the narrative in those countries and how they start to adapt and work together. What I heard was with the shift that we are seeing fundamentally in the next 18 to 24 months around how companies leverage AI, and how they start to think about applying it to their workforce and to their structures will start to have some dramatic shifts. And that will happen most likely. I think we think it's going to happen at these big multinationals, and that's where the shifts are going to start to happen. It's going to kind of spread out. I think it is more likely going to happen in where we see kind of up and coming companies, whether it be startups, mid market companies, companies who are have the flexibility to rethink and to adapt how they approach the problems they are trying to solve. They can do it at a much quicker pace. They can adapt to these technologies much quicker. They can rethink their organizational structures much quicker, and that will start to put pressure on these kind of larger multinational kind of big mover companies that we often look at to say, oh, they've now changed how they operate, and so we're all going to change how we operate. I think that pressure's already starting, and it's going to reach a pressure point, most likely in the next 18 to 24 months. We're going to start to see some more radical shifts in some of the larger corporations.
Yeah, it is a really interesting point. It's just harder to do it in an organization with history, established processes, protocols, and quite often quite a limited risk profile. Whereas for a startup or a smaller organization, you're not bound by what's been there before in the same way. So you can create in a different way. I think we saw it with microtransactions in banking. Lots
Yep.
of established organizations struggling to make that change. Whereas if you're a startup bank, or you were operating somewhere with less legacy technology, it was an easier thing to do. So, in the organizations that you see making use of AI well in either individual workflows or starting to do it at scale, what would you say distinguishes from an organization investing in this technology and not seeing a return, and some of the organizations really starting to see a difference?
I think that's actually a critical question because we're seeing a lot of conversation out there about whether or not the actual return on investment of the implementation of AI is actually performing the way people intended it to. And I think what we're starting to see is a dramatic shift between those companies who are applying AI, again, as I mentioned, to their current processes, workflows, and basically using it as an efficiency driver, right? This belief system that if I insert these tools into my workflows that currently exist, I'm going to create these efficiencies. We're going to work faster and we're going to accomplish more. Versus those companies who are actually looking at what's feasible and readjusting their entire framework for how they think about executing to their problems or building out their solution sets based on the technology that's available. So they're redesigning their workforce, they're redesigning their work processes, their workflows. So I'll give you a great example. I'm actually going to steal this from Rebecca Carr, who is our CEO. She talked about this conversation that she was in with a group of other CEOs in this 10X CEO group that she's in. And she said, listen, these are people who are out there actively thinking about how to evolve and build their companies and think about kind of how they're going to leverage technology to do that successfully. And she was talking with an individual who had been listening in to a conversation in the Silicon Valley with a new startup. There was a couple of gentlemen who were having a conversation about how they were starting to build out their company. And she realized, even though she was fresh in the space, wasn't necessarily a legacy company. Her understanding of how to organizationally design her company and what they were doing were two different things completely. She immediately realized they were thinking about things like, how do I think about AI as part of my workforce, not as an augmentation to my workforce, meaning just adding tool sets? How do I actually create an organizational infrastructure where AI agents are as much a part of my workforce plan as contingent, temporary, and full-time employees are? How does that or how do I orchestrate my organization to do it? She immediately realized she had to go back and rethink everything around how the jobs to be done in the organization were structured. Which jobs to be done could actually be achieved by leveraging some of these AI technologies that are in place to do them versus actually putting humans in that spot. And then how would the humans interact with them in a different way? And how would their jobs shift and change? I think that was a big eye opening moment as she starts to articulate this story and we start to look at the conversations that are happening in this space. It is the fundamental difference between saying, how do I take what my team currently does and apply technology to help them do that faster, more efficiently, more productively, kind of exponentially add value to what they're doing versus reorchestrating and re-looking at this is what my company's trying to do. And rather than just assume that it is going to be a person in the seat doing it, or I'm going to do it with the current process or flow that I actually execute to today, how could I leverage the technologies available to me to actually have it happen in a different way altogether? And the companies that are thinking that way, I think, are going to immediately start to leapfrog over the companies that are looking in these more traditional frameworks.
Which is really interesting because we think about what's the risk of this technology in terms of what it can replace. But actually, what you're saying is at the heart of it is a degree of leadership, vision, and creativity as to how you would deploy and integrate this technology in the first place. So when we think around, are leaders ready for this change? Because technology is moving on at a
Yep.
bewildering pace at times. So if anyone were to go and Google, whenever you're sitting down and watching or listening to this episode, if you look at the headlines from the previous week, you will have seen a major release from one of the major organizations doing something ridiculous. This week it's been, and this will date the episode, but it's been around Hollywood level movies being produced just from the odd prompt. Absolutely incredible stuff. All sorts of ethical questions, all sorts of commercial questions, but incredible potency. What do leaders need to do to get ready? And in particular, in the HR profession, in the people profession, what are the specific things that people need to do either in preparedness or actually need to be doing right now?
So I'm going to break this into two things that I think are important for leaders, particularly in the human resources space, to be thinking about. The first is I'm going to pose to them that there is an actual larger challenge they're going to need to address, which is individuals, those workers within their organizations' sense of identity, right? When AI can do things that a human took decades to learn how to do in moments, it shifts people's personal sense of value. And so that has downstream implications to how they choose to engage, their sense of connectedness to an organization, even their sense of how they can produce or provide value going forward. And we're going to have to address that at some level. How do we reshape the value paradigm for individuals inside our organizations? I think at a much more tactical level, the first thing we need to be doing is looking at how we think about work and how we contain or organize work. We've used this kind of jobs container, right? I'm going to call it a container, a job description, a framework to say this is the job that exists today. And it's been a very static element, right? We've said this is the job. People do this job. They are successful. All performance review, all compensation, all the ways in which we manage our kind of workforces around this container of this job. I think that as we start to see intelligence becoming part of the infrastructure, intelligent tools, intelligent solutions, or just intelligence in general, the ability to accomplish things not using kind of direct human intervention, it changes those jobs at a much more rapid pace. So I used to be able to go do a job restructuring program. Maybe, it used to be once every 5 years. Now maybe I'm doing it once every 2 years. Maybe my team's looking at it once every year, but it's still a relatively slow pace of change in which I do that. Jobs themselves, that framework is going to change much more rapidly now. And so we've got to break it down and stop thinking about connecting people to jobs and start thinking about connecting people to tasks or and leveraging unique capabilities at scale. It is, I think, the thing that will start to actually move us down the path to the ability to actually do more productive workforce planning. It is the next evolution of kind of skills mapping that we've been talking about, but it'll be much more related to task mapping than to skills mapping. And this is a body of work that I think HR in particular, human resources professionals need to start paying attention to and thinking about because it sounds like a very basic thing to rethink the job structure. But if you think about it, that job structure, how we have created it, fundamentally drives everything in our workforce organization framework today. It is Again, how we think about compensation, how we think about organizational structure within an organization, how we think about performance, how we think about potential. All of it is related to this container of a job, which I think is going to become more and more obsolete. And we're going to have to figure out what that new container is, if there is one, and how we adjust to it.
And the most interesting thing when everything's up in the air is how much agency you have over how it comes down. If I may, I want to take you back because you made a fascinating point around
Mhm.
identity. So I'm kind of looking forward to reading the book already. But so much of who we are is wrapped up into quite often our professions and our experience. If you ask someone at a party, what do you do? They're more likely to say, I'm an accountant or I do a different role than they are explain that they're a parent or their relationship to other people, where so much of our identity is trapped up in there. How big a threat do you think this is to people? And is there a role for the profession to play in helping people understand that shift and change as part of change management rather than just see this as a threat to their self, a threat to their identity?
So I think it's actually a fairly big, I don't know if I use the word threat, I think impact to us as individuals. And I think it comes, I think you identified it perfectly, which is if we look through kind of the history of human existence, we have for hundreds of years aligned what we do to who we are. And it's not just our identity in terms of how I define myself to you, but it's how I am judged by others, how others perceive me, how I am perceived within the ecosystem, right? So, it used to be feudal times. My parent was a baker. So I'm going to go apprentice and become a baker. And that's kind of how I managed it from. And then that first shift in identity happened when we started to have some autonomy and some sense of agency. And we could say, well, I'm not going to be a baker just because my parent was a baker. I'm going to make some other alternate choices, right? So that was that first kind of opening and awakening. I kind of call it kind of the crack in the system that sheds some light into the system. Now we're hitting this next big crack, which says if my job, it even goes past there. It's not just can I make a different choice about what I do, but how can I define myself differently based not just on how people identify my job or my function. That's the first level of identity we've got to address. And that's really going to be challenging for organizations because, again, how do we manage hierarchy within organizations and structures, right? It's not just the job you do, it's also the title you have. It's the structure you like. We have layers of identity management that are kind of functioned in that. So how do you create an environment where somebody, maybe it's not about getting the next promotion, becoming a director to a VP or you know, a lead to a manager, what now becomes the thing that identifies your additional contribution, your growth within that cycle? That's from a HR perspective, the biggest space we need to focus on to help people be able to get this comfort with this identity shift. The second is when intelligence becomes infrastructure, it puts at risk our own sense of our personal value. So I kind of put it this way. I have been in the space of talent acquisition and technology now for at least the last 20 years. Over that time, I have accumulated knowledge, right, from a variety of different ways. I have done it through practice. I have done it through learning from people. I have done it through reading. I've done a variety of different things. Today, somebody could walk into my seat and open up ChatGPT and ask it a question and have the same access to the knowledge I acquired over 20 years of research and in-depth knowledge. And if they are able to manage discernment and judgment successfully, have problem solving skills, can leverage that to accomplish what I accomplish just as easily. So, what does that mean about my value and my worth? It's no longer in how long did it take for me to learn to do something, right? Because effort is equated to value. It's now how can I make decisions? How can I interpret whether something is accurate or inaccurate? How can I be able to discern what to leverage and how to use information? That changes the paradigm of where value is. So, it's not how much I know anymore, it's how am I able to acquire and leverage information to accomplish tasks, which is a very different framework for identity. And it also, again, goes back to that whole job framework for us.
There's a really interesting interplay there that's probably worth pulling out because
Mhm.
I think it's an inherent tension, which is to be able to spot whether something is a good judgment call or not, it requires experience. And yet we're creating systems that to some extent are kind of disintermediating experience. They're able to pull upon a range of data points and knowledge. And as you say, kind of accelerate their experience, not through years, but actually just through access. How do you think that's going to play out over the next few years? Because it's a really fascinating one, I think, in many professions. You've got entry level roles where potentially the experience will be very different to if you spend decades working up through it. But you still have potentially accountability for understanding whether an answer that's proposed is the right one or the wrong one. And it seems an inherent tension between those two things.
It's a huge tension. In fact, it's one of the biggest problem statements that we're already starting to see occur. I love that you brought up this tension moment with entry level jobs. There's a bunch of data out there that we're starting to look at right now that says if you look at the job market today, you can see that this perceptual decline that everybody assumed was going to happen in both middle management and kind of leadership and technical jobs. We thought we were going to see this big decline in the job market, and we aren't seeing it. What we're actually seeing is a decline in entry level. Why? Because the people I would bring in, those places where you would learn, right? The initial basic jobs that you would first walk into are now the ones being replaced by these automations and intelligent systems. I don't need them as much, and so I hire less of them. This is already getting ready to cause a challenge for us. That means exactly what you just said. People then are actively participating in those roles where they are learning that discernment and skill level to be able to attribute what is good information, what's bad information, how do I learn through experience, what will happen if I make X decision versus Y decision. That learning process, we're already seeing people are not going to be in those spaces and roles. So what does that mean? In the short term, what that means is those people who are sitting in the middle today actually have an opportunity to accelerate faster. But there is now a responsibility within organizations to figure out how we are growing these discernment and decision skill sets in this kind of upcoming generation that's coming into the workforce, and figuring out how we are proactively building processes to build our bench, because the bench isn't going to exist. And I think companies think they're going to get away with this because I may not be building the bench, but another company is, and I'll just hire them away and pull them into mine. What we're seeing is it's happening universally and globally, which means there is no bench. And if there is no bench, then what happens after that space? I don't have a fancy answer to that one. I know it's a problem statement.
Yeah, but it's strategically, if everyone's attempting to pinch from a group of people that aren't there, it's quite challenging, isn't it? Um,
Yeah.
lots of what we've discussed is it's at that really interesting intersection between risk and opportunity, and there's obviously a lot of change that's happening at the moment. How well do you think organizations are navigating this balance between getting people aware of what's happening in the pace of change and resolving the tensional concern there might be about that potential change?
Well, I don't transparently think they're doing it very well at all right now. I think that's exactly what we're starting to see. It's what I heard in Davos. It's what I'm hearing across the board. I think that there are two conversations going on. There is this conversation around kind of where we're headed, the impact, and how do we start to think about strategies around this. And then there is the everyday individual who is kind of working within their space. And the everyday individual and even the everyday organization today is not proactively thinking about how their entire framework is going to shift in the next 18, 24, 38 months as we move kind of down that space. And the challenge means these conversations aren't happening. People aren't having an active dialogue with it. I'm going to give you a great example. I yesterday went in and was doing a presentation to a group of customers who are looking to migrate onto a new system. They are the tech part of the team, the administrators of the human capital management systems within their organizations. And I can tell you the level of dialogue and conversation was much more about how do I create efficiency? How do I resolve problem blocks I have with things like fields and kind of real basic architecture components? They weren't asking bigger questions about, does this workflow even need to exist anymore? Is there a different, now do I have to do it the same way? Could I do it in a different way? What would that look like? To me, that's a challenging space to be in, because if we're not having those conversations, then that means we're not having the next level of conversation that says, how are we preparing? And it will hit us, and it will hit us hard. I think the consequence will be a lot of what we call kind of legacy organizations and companies will fall by the wayside, and we'll see a new wave of organization arise, which are the individuals and companies who are not tethered by legacy behaviors and processes and thinking, that are really, because they're having to be scrappy, having to think about new ways to do things, because that's just fundamentally what they have to do to survive. They will actually end up surpassing companies who are going to need to have to think about retrofitting and being reactive, because they're not going to do it. Most of our legacy companies, transparently, are not engineered to proactively think about how to prepare for tomorrow. They're trying to exist in today and to be more efficient with today. And that is going to be a problem. Or it could be an opportunity.
Bit of both, isn't it? I mean, strengths and weaknesses are always contextual, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, based on your conversations with not just actually at that event or kind of within that, but with leaders across the profession and beyond, and your own personal insights, what would you say the 3 priorities should be for HR and people leaders that they can't afford to delay on? So, what are the things that they need to be doing today?
Yeah. So the number one thing they have to do today is take a real honest assessment of what it is the work is trying to accomplish, and have a real conversation amongst themselves about how that work could be done given the technologies that exist today. How much of that really needs to be done by humans? How much of that needs to be done by machines? Where do the right checks and balances need to exist? That's a re-engineering conversation. It's a redesign conversation of the work and how they execute it that they need to do. And they need to do that sooner rather than later. That will translate into the second step, which will be the work they need to do then to break down that, to understand what are the actual tasks that we need to get people to be able to successfully execute against, and how do I assess whether people have the skills to do that, and then how do I build them within that ecosystem. So for me, those are the top 2 things. And then honestly, they have to start paying attention, not just to what is being sold to them as a tool to use, or kind of looking at somebody to, looking for a vendor or somebody to walk in the door to prepackage for them a solution. They really need to be proactively thinking about what would they want, because a lot of companies who are trying to fill the gap to solve problems for them are looking at what their previous problem sets were and answering those, not answering the ones for the future. And they're looking for companies and individuals to tell them what they need, rather than just kind of accepting what's being given to them. That's going to be a challenge.
Absolutely. And it's that kind of old adage, isn't it? That, if you've got an hour to solve a problem, spend the first 55 minutes kind of thinking about the problem itself, not the solution. It
Yep.
is a good place to start. Have to reflect on what really are we solving for here. And as you say, not an assumption that that's the same as in previous years. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciated it. I know it's morning where you are and we're one of your first appointments, so really appreciate this. You did a wonderful article with our magazine, People Management, and we'll put the link to that in the notes for this show. Other than that, I'd like to invite you back, if you'd like to, at some point, to come and talk about the
Right.
book when that's closer to launch. But thank you so much for your time. This
Love
has
it.
been
Thank you
these.
so much.
Oh, that's good. Well, we'll absolutely take a bit of love there. This has been the CIPD's HR People Pod. My name's David D'Souza. You'll find notes for this show alongside the episode, whether you're watching it through video or any of the other sources. Do make sure that you subscribe. And you'll also find alongside, as I say, our regular pieces, a series of specials. We've done Matty Side recently. We've had Professor Kevin Fong talking about the emergency services and leadership under pressure. And we also had a whole host of podcast hosts come and join us for a kind of mega pod on predictions for the year ahead. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much to our guests, and do take care.